The mantra of the lazy dungeon master. Of all the prep you do, maybe 10% will actually come into play. Mike Mearls, head of Dungeons & Dragons Research and Design. We begin with a simple core concept, a simple statement to keep in mind while preparing our games. It is the concept around which the rest of this book revolves. Prepare only what benefits your game. A simple statement, yet difficult to follow. We all know the maxims, keep it simple and less is more. Regardless, many of us live lives that are far from simple. Figuring out what truly benefits your game takes considerable thought. Every time you pull back the reins on your overactive imagination, your mind will buck and kick and spit as it tries to push forward, to fill in all the blanks, define every variable, and build out every detail before your game is even started. The success or failure of a game does not depend on the amount of time you spend preparing it. The story exists among a group of people at the table, and is as good or bad as what those people bring to it. Prepare only what most benefits your game. What will you stop doing? Good creative works come from what gets eliminated, not what gets added. What will you remove from your game and your preparation to refine it? What will you eliminate to keep your time and energy focused in the right area? Appendix B presents the results of a survey with 817 dungeon masters on their game preparation techniques. Looking at the list, which activities do you find most beneficial to your game? Which ones are least beneficial? Why do you still do them? But I like preparing my game. This will likely be the biggest criticism of this book's ideas. We like building our games. We like setting up detailed encounter areas and figuring out all the nuances of games. We like setting up detailed encounter areas and figuring out all the nuances of our story. We love building worlds and histories and political webs. We enjoy all of that work, and it makes our games better, right? Maybe not. What feels productive might not be. You might spend a good deal of time designing a monster or a scene or an encounter area only to have it fall apart when your players come to the table. Sometimes all the preparation in the world won't result in a better game for your group. As an example, according to Michael Mallon, writer of the id DM blog, the worst session he ever ran was the one for which he felt most prepared. All the time you spend preparing your game might feel useful, but instead it might be steering you away from the most important activities you may be subconsciously avoiding. Creativity and the Resistance. In his popular self-help book, The War of Art, Steven Pressfield writes about a concept called the resistance. In the book, Pressfield describes the resistance as an insidious force that prevents people from making and finishing creative works. The resistance is anything that gets in the way of true creation, whether justified or not. In fact, this is one of the most interesting and challenging things about the resistance. The resistance might be something perfectly reasonable and rational. How can you write a novel when you're fighting cancer? How can you quit your job and learn to paint when you have 4 kids to support and 2 mortgages? No one would expect you to dive into these creative enterprises when you are faced with such reasonable limitations. But there's still the resistance. The resistance is anything, rational or not, that gets in the way of true creativity, whether it's writing a novel or preparing your weekly D&D game. The resistance and game preparation. This is where things like monster building get interesting. You might look at monster building and think it's good creative work. You have a goal and an output. You know when you're done. But is monster creation truly creative? What if what you thought was a creative output is actually the resistance? What could you be doing instead? What are you avoiding? Some of the areas that have the greatest impact on your story may end up being the most creatively challenging. Improving improvisation is one such example, one we'll discuss later in the book. Building your campaign around the stories of the player characters, PCs, might be another. Sometimes the most creative enterprise is simply learning to let the game build itself at the table. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing. Being lazy is hard. Quit trying to control everything and just let go. Tyler Durden, Fight Club. We all love this hobby. As dungeon masters, we have the drive to create worlds, tell stories, design dungeons, build encounters, and craft non-player characters, NPCs. It takes trust and energy to let go of our games and leave off the preparation. It takes a surprising amount of energy to stop doing things. That drive to create still exists in us, and will continue to exist even if we decide to go lazy and skip a lot of things we used to prepare. Just let go. Much of this drive comes from being afraid to let things leave our control. None of us want our games to suck, and we assume that a lack of preparation will result in a terrible game. If we're not prepared, how can the game possibly go well? Learning to let things get out of control feels counterintuitive, and it's really hard to do. Running a D&D game isn't the same as writing a book, and even the best authors of fiction know that wonderful stories don't come from a lot of planning, but instead from letting the story live and breathe on its own. Your stories, too, aren't created when you write up an adventure, plot out a story, or build a new monster. They're created at the table when 6 people bring a story to life. Yet the drive remains to plan and prepare. How might you steer that energy to the right place? Channel the drive to create. Channeling your energy toward the right goals will keep you feeling useful before a game. You can use the energy you would normally spend on less useful activities in areas that will directly benefit your game. 2 main areas merit your focus. First, you can build the bedrock for adventure, such as interesting NPCs and fantastic locations. Second, you can focus on developing the tools and techniques you need to improvise and react to the evolving story of your game as it unfolds. We will cover the details of these ideas further in this book. The dangers of over-preparation. No plan survives contact with the players. Davina Oakes, the She DM. Being a lazy dungeon master isn't just about saving time. It's about spending time where it has the most impact on the enjoyment of you and your group. There are other more dangerous things than simply wasting time. Let's explore some of the potential dangers of over-preparation. You spend your time in areas that matter little to the game. Of the 470 surveyed dungeon masters who run weekly D&D games, 38% spend 30 minutes or more designing monsters. Read about the DM survey in Appendix B. The most popular versions of Dungeons & Dragons, we'll stick to Pathfinder, D&D 3.5, and D&D 4th edition for this discussion, contain hundreds to thousands of monsters across all levels. There's little need to build one more, regardless of your desire to do so. So all this makes logical sense until you feel that drive to custom build a new villain. It might take you 15 minutes or an hour to build the monster depending on the edition. And that monster might get killed in only a couple of rounds of play. You might never get to show off the true capabilities of these monsters. You build up too much stake in your material. The more time you spend preparing your game, the more you want your players to experience what you prepared. If you spend 3 hours setting up a beautiful 3-dimensional encounter area, how likely are you to let the players find a creative way to skip it? How pissed off will you be when a pain-in-the-ass wizard casts Fly and everyone soars over it like a flock of seagulls, including the hare? Every bit of time you spend preparing for your game emotionally commits you to use those results. You want your players to see the stuff you make. Therefore, the more stuff you make, the less likely you are to let your players deviate from that course. It comes down to the feeling of control. What frightens dungeon masters the most is the feeling that our game will suck because we didn't bother to prepare. The more control we apply to the game ahead of time, the better we feel. But your game isn't about controlling the story. It's about letting the story run free. Think back over the games in your life, to the most memorable moments of those games. How many of those moments were pre-scripted by the DM, and how many of them were memorable simply because no one at the table had any idea what was about to happen? This doesn't mean your planned ideas are useless, but they might serve better as ideas to tap later than as a fully filled out story. You build a story before it should be built. DMs might often think the stories happen when they type out their adventure notes or build a map, but the true story is told when the game runs at the table. How much should we write ahead of time for a story that is supposed to happen during our game? How do you prepare for a spontaneous story to erupt? You certainly don't do so by writing up 6 pages of prose you expect everyone to follow. The story of our games occurs at the table, not beforehand. The more you try to fill out the story ahead of time, the more likely you'll fall into a scripted, rehearsed, and potentially boring plot. There are ways to avoid all of these and still have fun preparing for your game. It isn't about building stories, though. It's about building the stage, weaving in the backgrounds and desires of the PCs, wiring in personalities of the NPCs, and building the world in which the whole group tells their story at the table, not on your computer a week earlier. 5-minute adventure preparation. How little can I possibly prepare and still have a satisfying and interesting game? Robin D. Laws, author of Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastery and co-author of the Dungeon Master's Guide 2. Sly Flourish's Dungeon Master Tips contained a checklist of 12 steps needed to build an adventure. We're going to shorten that to 3 simple questions. Where does your adventure begin? To what 3 areas might your adventure lead? What are the 3 notable NPCs up to? These 3 questions give you enough to feel like you have a general handle on your next game without giving you so much detail that the game can't head in new and interesting ways on its own. In order to capture the answers to these 3 questions, let's use a DM's best tool, the 3x5 card. 3x5 card adventure design. The 3x5 card has many advantages as a Dungeon Master tool. It's cheap, it's simple, and it's constrained. It gives you the freedom to build out your world but forces you to remain within the boundaries of the card. The next few chapters will show you how to use a 3x5 card to build out an entire adventure or the seed of a complete campaign. For now, let's look at a quick summary. Where does the adventure begin? First, you must understand where your adventure begins. There will be a moment as your group settles down when they look to you to start the game. This is one part of the game you can't improvise. You need to know where things start. The actual preparation for the beginning of the game might be nothing more than a single sentence, such as, "We begin in the audience chambers of Lord Graham, Lord of the town of Winterfell, and he's pissed because orcs continue to harass merchants along the White Flint Road." You don't actually read that statement aloud to your group, but it gives you just enough to know where to start and clue you in to some potential options. As your core mantra revolves in your head, you know not to go overboard. You might want to fill out all the details in the room or understand the depth of Graham's angst. Don't succumb to these feelings. Let it go and work instead on building Graham into a character that you and your friends know and understand. What paths lie ahead? Instead of building out an entire campaign, world, or multi-threaded adventure, narrow your story down to just a few potential options. Choose enough to give your players some real choices, but not so many that they become paralyzed. Keep your choices down to 3. These choices help in a few ways. It gives players a few options from which to pick without making things too narrow. If your group tends to look to you for direction, you have 3 directions for them to take. It also shows them there is enough room to potentially choose a 4th or a combination of 2 of the 3 choices. Most important, writing down 3 options helps you feel prepared. If you feel prepared, you'll be more comfortable before and during the game. What have the NPCs been up to? The third question gives your game the true depth it needs to be a living, breathing world. Where have your NPCs been? What have they been doing while the PCs have been going about their business? How have the NPCs collided with one another? These questions breathe life into the game. They help move things and shift things in new directions game to game, and when your players see the results, they know they're in much more than a dungeon full of monsters springing from closets. What about larger campaigns? Maybe you're just in the beginning stages of a big campaign. You'll need a lot more than this, right? Not really. In some later chapters, we'll discuss ways to get our heroes together so they don't just all start in a bar. But for the campaign itself, you don't need to think much farther than your first scene in your first game. Campaigns don't need planning, and they're often more fun the less you plan them out. You might want to have an idea what the overall theme and plot of your campaign might be, but you don't want to outline it all out at once, or you'll risk forcing your players down a single track. Instead, focus on the same 3 questions. Where will your game begin? What 3 potential paths lay ahead? What are your 3 notable PCs up to? While a half dozen to a dozen other activities may fill your checklist, these are the only 3 required to keep things moving along. The next time you're sitting down to begin your 4-hour preparation session, try spending the first 5 minutes on this. It might end up being the only 5 minutes you need to spend. With your 3x5 card in hand, let's take a closer look at all 3 of these concepts in the next 3 chapters. Beginning your adventure. Of the 3 areas upon which to focus your energy, the first lies in understanding where your adventure begins. As with the rest of your preparation, you should focus on what matters most and eliminate the rest. This means keeping your beginning as small as it needs to be with only the details required to start things off, and give your players enough to let the story unfold at the table. More than starting in a bar. If your introduction is too generic, it probably won't help. An overused general beginning doesn't set your adventure apart and doesn't fire up the engines of the imaginations at the table. You want enough detail to make the setting unique, and to raise an eyebrow or 2. Here's a poor example. The party begins at the Adventurers Guild while awaiting new missions. That doesn't give you anything to work off of. It doesn't spur the imaginations of the players. It won't make you feel like you have a handle on the adventure. The party begins at the Adventurers Guild in Whitefall, where they overhear of the deaths of their friendly rivals at the ruins beneath the Blue Twins Mountain. Now you have some flavor. You have somewhere to start. If this is your first adventure, you might not have any idea what the ruins beneath the Blue Twins Mountain actually is, or anything about the background of the rival gang. You might fill in the details a little bit more, but you have your initial start, and you know how things might begin. Give yourself a lead without following through. You don't, however, want to fill in the rest of the story. The minute you're typing out a seed and you have the urge to start writing more, stop. That's the moment when the story can run free. The storyteller in you may want to grab your net and go catch that fleeting winged idea. But don't. Let it go free and land raw and untamed in the middle of the gaming table. Let the rest of the group start to draw from the details, unleashing their imaginations into the mix and building it out in ways you might never have dreamed of. That's the sort of adventure everyone will remember in 10 years. The Adventure's Elevator Pitch. In Dungeon Master Tips, I describe the idea of a campaign elevator pitch as a replacement for world building. This concept of a short, focused, single-sentence description works just as well for individual adventures. How would you summarize your whole adventure in a single sentence? If it takes you more than a sentence, it's probably too long. Keeping things simple leaves your game lots of room to evolve into something beautiful, unique, and entertaining. Example: Yellowtop. Throughout this book, I have chosen a single example to use with each of these concepts. Let's begin with the seed. In the salt mining town of Yellowtop, tyrannical mercenaries leave the body of a resistance leader in the street with a dagger in his chest. This seed gives all of us enough of a start to have an idea what this adventure is about. Revolution. As you begin preparing for your own adventure, take out your 3x5 note card and write down, in just a few words, the core seed of your story. It doesn't need to be as well spelled out as the example above, but it should have enough details to remind you of the ideas. Got your seed down on your 3x5 card? Good. Now let's move on to the 3 potential paths of your adventure. The 3 paths. Once you have your game's beginning seed written down on the top of your 3x5 card, write underneath it the 3 paths your game might take. Sometimes these paths might be linear, the 3 scenes that will occur as the party navigates a relatively linear dungeon. Other times they might represent the 3 main choices the group might make to decide where they're headed next. Professional improvisation actor and Dungeons & Dragons freelancer Steve Townsend refers to this idea as his 3 things. He begins planning his adventure by deciding first where the PCs will end up, then decides where they begin, and then what they will find in the middle. You might instead choose 3 adventure locations the PCs might discover, leaving the paths open for your PCs but the locations rich and deep enough to warrant their attention. Focusing on only 3 loose locations or scenes creates a more sandbox-style adventure in which the PCs have 3 locations they might explore. Whatever method you choose, having 3 paths, locations, or scenes for your game will give you just enough detail to feel comfortable without overwhelming your story or your players. You want just enough to give you and your players enough direction to build the game at the table. Though focused, your options shouldn't be too vague. Here are some examples of options that don't have enough detail. The party travels to the neighboring town. The party goes into the nearby ruins. The party investigates the local thieves' guild. Here are some options with enough details to guide you at the table. The party chases the evil priest Ralthor to the nearby corrupt town of Nin. The party travels to the nearby ruins where gnolls have set up their slave camp. Through their subtlety or direct force, the party enters the thieves' den below the sewers of Ashton. Generally speaking, you want these events or locations to tie back to your main adventure seed, either as a potential sequence of events or as a hub of different directions. These examples have enough detail to get the gears rolling without building out too much. They give you the feeling that you can easily improvise based on the directions of your players. They aren't, however, so structured that your players can't come up with other potential paths to follow, something you want to reinforce by not building things out too much. Example: the adventure locations of Yellowtop. Following through with the Yellowtop adventure seed, let's build 3 areas that might be used in the adventure. On that 3x5 card, let's write 3 potential adventure locations and a few key ideas surrounding them. Greystone Manor, former noble house, now mercenary headquarters. The salt mines. Former center for the town's industry, now closed down when they found a dark power buried deep within. Leads from Yellowtop to Ashland Fortress. Ashland Fortress. High in the mountains, a ruined keep now inhabited by hobgoblin and ogre mercenaries. 2 trebuchets threaten the destruction of the town. Now this little micro-universe is coming together, but without overwriting the details. We have some adventure locations, we have some ideas of history and threat. We have enough to feel like there's some adventure to be had, even if it's not all tied together yet. What do we use to tie these locations to your adventure seed? Non-player characters. Character-driven stories. During the third component of adventure preparation, you want to determine the backgrounds and activities of most of the important NPCs in your adventure or campaign. The paths and reactions of these NPCs flow like the lifeblood of the story and act as the sinew that binds the scenes and locations to the seed of the adventure. The actions of the NPCs move the rest of the story forward. Although the ancient history of the place might seem interesting, it is relatively static compared to the movements of living NPCs. Consider a pool table filled with balls. As one ball collides with another, it takes a new path, potentially colliding with another. Sometimes they smash hard together, other times they just rub off one another and veer in a new direction. The actions and interactions of the game's NPCs collide the same way. The PCs are the most active balls on this table, smashing and colliding and rebounding all over the place. It is the actions and motivations of the PCs that will fuel the story. Throughout their journey, they interact with all sorts of NPCs, creating new paths and reactions from session to session. It gets really exciting when an action taken by the PCs begins a chain of events outside of their view, until it comes careening back toward them from a different angle a few sessions later. Now they might see the results of their actions and tie it back together to the original actions they took. It becomes really interesting when the players are able to piece it back together again, like Sherlock Holmes tracking a criminal's motive back from the murder scene. With some of this character-driven philosophy in mind, let's get pragmatic about using NPCs in your lazy D&D game. Although your PCs will drive the main story, you shouldn't prepare too much to drive their stories forward. Instead, focus on the NPCs you do control. Flip over your 3x5 card with the adventure seed and 3 branches on it and get ready for the NPCs. Focus on 3 important ally NPCs. Great stories come from great characters. Keeping in mind that creativity comes from limitation, try to keep the number of these characters low. It's hard to remember a bunch of new characters, and no one wants to jump directly into Book 4 of The Song of Ice and Fire. Sticking to 3 primary NPCs helps your group remember who they are and details of their idiosyncrasies. Example: Yellowtop NPCs. Going back to Yellowtop, let's identify 3 key NPCs. Lord Cansliff Greystone, Lord of Yellowtop, paid off by mercenaries, displaced from his home and secretly hopes for revolution. Levasque, diplomat, alchemist, and quote-unquote terrorist. Led attacks and revolutions previously and is now in exile. Currently seeks heroes to displace the local mercenaries. Davins, former businessman and salt miner, seeks to overthrow the mercenaries, appalled at the murder of the resistance leader. None of these characters are doing anything yet because the story hasn't begun. As the adventures go forward, let's track the actions of these NPCs in addition to the progress of the PCs. Let's focus on backgrounds and motivations of the NPCs first so we know what they will do when they begin to interact with the PCs. On the 3x5 card containing the adventure seed, describe these 3 NPCs so that you have their names and enough of a background to remember who they are. Over the course of a campaign, consider giving each of these NPCs their own card to track their actions over time. Focus on 1 to 3 enemy NPCs. Good stories need good villains. Sly Flourish's Dungeon Master Tips already discusses the process for creating great villains, but I will quickly summarize it with the following points. Good villains have a reason for being the way they are. Good villains think what they are doing is right. Great villains actually are right. Good villains aren't static, they have plots and plans. Good villains are smart. Keeping this in mind, let's focus on the ideal number of villains, 1 to 3. 1 is the perfect number for a story with 1 focus. 3 villains are enough to have a lot of interesting twists and turns in a longer story. More than 3, and the story won't feel focused. Your players won't really care about any particular one because their focus will be diluted. Example: Yellowtop villains. Let's take a look at the Yellowtop villains. Theor Whitescar, noble mercenary with pencil-thin mustache, brutal and dictatorial, resides in Greystone Manor with a host of bodyguards. Captain Blackhand, leader of the Ashland Goblinoid mercenaries, looks forward to unleashing the trebuchets on the village. Father Moorland, the priest of a dark god, Father Moorland looks like the type of fat priest who travels with the mercenaries, adores children, particularly as sacrifices, lures in victims with kindness. Again, before the story has begun, the villains may not yet have acted. You want enough background to know what direction they will head to once the story does begin. Flip over that 3x5 card again, and describe these 3 villains on the back. If they end up lasting more than 1 or 2 sessions, they will deserve their own 3x5 card to keep track of their actions. Improvise secondary NPCs. Just because you focus on 4 to 6 primary NPCs, both allies and villains, that doesn't mean the rest of the world doesn't exist. Secondary NPCs are equally important in making a world feel real. These guys won't have 4,000-word biographies. Of course, neither should your primary NPCs. In fact, they probably don't need much more than a name and a primary occupation. The rest can come about organically. The secondary NPCs serve 2 main functions. They breathe life into the rest of the world, and they serve as the pool from which primary NPCs emerge. Because you do not always know who will be primary NPCs and who will be secondary, you need to be ready to promote a secondary into a primary. In later sections, this book will cover some tools to help you build rich secondary NPCs with no preparation. Rotate NPCs in and out. As the game moves on, as the balls collide and roll off in different directions, it's quite possible that a primary NPC may fall out of view of the group. They had their time in the spotlight, but now it's time for someone else. At this point, you can promote a secondary NPC to a primary. The good news is that you largely don't need to worry about who to choose. The players will often choose for you. Maybe they like the French accent of that innkeeper. Maybe they promote the huge well-spoken bandit lord as the chief of their new business venture. Whatever happens, stay flexible in promoting one NPC and demoting another. The same is true for villains. Maybe the PCs killed the primary villain in a glorious battle, or pushed him into a cauldron of molten rock. Now the second in command, who was always the smarter one, finally takes the position for which she was born and becomes a new and even more dangerous villain. She would never be caught in a situation where a cauldron of molten rock posed a threat. Good NPCs build a network of potential story ideas, but the best story ideas will come from your players and their PCs. Let's look at how you can tie all these threads together into a fantastic story. Tying PCs to the story. So far, we've focused on building out all you need for a single adventure, or maybe a series of gaming sessions focused around a single idea. Larger campaigns require a little more planning, however. Most important, they require that dungeon masters build and tie the story around the backgrounds and arcs of the PCs. Players will care less about these tie-ins for short-run games, but for longer campaigns, it's important to always keep the PCs at the center of the stories. In his Dungeon Master Experience article, What's My Motivation?, Chris Perkins describes the lessons learned in tying character backgrounds into your existing story with the following 3 points. Build on what the player gives you. Be willing to take your campaign in new directions. Suggest ideas that have future adventure possibilities. The Way of the Lazy Dungeon Master helps considerably with 2 of these 3 points. First, as you have only a vague outline prepared in the first place, building on what the player gives you becomes much easier. The whole story might end up focusing on the characters. The second point also becomes much easier. If you have no focused campaign in the first place beyond the campaign elevator pitch, you will have little difficulty in modifying the campaign to fit the character's background and motivations. It's a lot easier to correct your course when no course is laid out in the first place. D&D organized play veteran and published Wizards of the Coast freelancer Teos Abadia spends an hour per session considering how PCs fit into his story. Many other veteran dungeon masters agree. Building the stories from the backgrounds and motivations of your PCs will greatly enhance your players' enjoyment of your game. They will feel far greater connection to the story when it's directly tied to their own PCs. Appendix C contains a series of questionnaires with veteran DMs, many of whom pointed these PC story threads as a highly valuable element to their game preparation. As you plan your campaign, consider keeping a single 3x5 card for each of the PCs, with a few key words on their backgrounds, motivations, and potential ties to the ongoing organic story. Reference these cards as you consider where each week's adventure goes. You might not need to spend an hour tying these PC threads into the story, as Teos does, but any time spent here draws your players much closer to the story as it evolves. More importantly, reviewing these cards before each session helps you spontaneously tie them in when the moment presents itself at the game.